the overall path of Pastel, we had actually built a custom layer one that was more of a fork of Bitcoin, right? And what we realized is that there were certain performance inefficiencies with respect to both transaction speed, block finality, etc. And it made more sense, especially when you look at our hybrid consensus mechanism, which leverages what we call supernodes.
Anthony, first of all, thanks a lot for taking the time and do this podcast with me. I know you have a lot on your plate. Leading a project like this is never easy. I always like to start from the beginning and see exactly who is the person I'm speaking with, especially because in this industry, you're either born into it, you're like a kid, or you had like maybe another career before jumping into crypto. So I don't know, who's Anthony before joining crypto?
Yeah, for sure. Nice to meet you. So basically, my background in the space actually more or less came from the lens of a developer. Uh, I started off, prior to crypto, spent some time in the venture capital world. Realized I wanted to become, more technical in terms of both just being able to look at companies, diligence companies. Was very curious about how a lot of the just general infrastructure technologies worked. Ended up pursuing masters in computer science and robotics, and during those studies, I really came across the early wave of crypto and a lot of the initial cryptographic primitives. Ended up following that curiosity, listened to a very early podcast on really quote unquote Web3 tokenized economies, things like that. Dived down a rabbit hole, found myself doing some open source contribution development work for a very early Ethereum dApp called the Golem Network, which is more or less very um, permeating across a lot of the themes of Web3 today. And then from there, fell more in love with obviously the concept of tokenization, democratization, etc., and decided I wanted to invest a lot in the space. And ended up launching at the time what was actually called Cryptos Capital, rebranded to Innovating Capital, to really focus on the next wave of deep technical infrastructure oriented investments. What is the world going to look like in 10, 20 years, with a huge focus on the Web3 and tokenized landscape?
Into this journey, are you still running the VC right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And so obviously with respect to the VC, we're very hands on in terms of our overall portfolio companies. We usually develop a thesis from the bottoms up with regards to certain issues or problems that we're trying to solve. How can certain technological advancements help facilitate certain areas of innovation? And in some instances, we develop a thesis in an area where we don't necessarily come across or find really investable opportunities. And we decide to
Mm,
really build those and incubate those in house, which brings us obviously to Lumera.
exactly.
Um, mhm.
But were you like an investor in Cosmos ecosystem projects? Or asking this because Lumera is built on top of Cosmos, and I wanted to know why you choose to build on top of Cosmos, and what is your relationship with this ecosystem?
Yeah, for sure. So we're not invested in Interchain Labs directly. We are
Hmm.
invested in a number of Cosmos-based ecosystem projects, Injective, Zion, etc. And we're very both close and familiar with the broader ecosystem. So to take a step back, Lumera, which is actually rebranded and forked out of Pastel. Pastel at the time was, very much so a purpose-built app chain. We were very focused from an investment perspective with respect to layer ones that could provision a certain amount of dedicated resources, both in terms of storage and computation, to more general purpose L1s like Solana, Ethereum, etc. And while we've seen a lot of innovation and advancement in terms of overall vertical innovation, scaling solutions, on-chain storage of the likes, etc., there hasn't necessarily been a lot of horizontal innovation, right? Dedicated, isolated L1s that are more or less purpose-built to provision resources to these general purpose providers, aka. Mhm.
So from that point, exactly from Pastel to what is Lumera today, how would you explain it in simple terms and what is the problem that you want to solve?
Yeah. So Pastel, in terms of the difference between the two, the core problem that's being solved, what services we're providing to our customers or our partners, really a decentralized cloud designed for AI, designed for huge amounts of data, designed for applications that are operating in a decentralized fashion that need to last, where instead of trusting one company to store data, run models, you rely on a network that proves it's actually doing the work. Between Pastel and Lumera, same exact thing. The only difference is that on the overall path of Pastel, we had actually built a custom layer one that was more of a fork of Bitcoin, right? And what we realized is that there were certain performance inefficiencies with respect to both transaction speed, block finality, etc. And it made more sense, especially when you look at our hybrid consensus mechanism, which leverages what we call supernodes and something called proof of service. It made more sense to have that built on a proof of stake network. Cosmos became a very natural fit for us, given obviously a lot of the existing modules that are heavily supported, tried, true, tested across the ecosystem. And so we more or less lifted a lot of the core infrastructure we built and moved it from one chain to the other. And that's what led to the fork and the creation of Lumera.
So basically an upgrade to the Cosmos SDK.
Absolutely.
And what do you feel like is the main unlock proof of service has beyond proof of stake?
Yeah, for sure. So most L1s usually stop at consensus, right?
Mhm.
Who owns what, right? Lumera kind of goes a step further. Who actually did the work and did they do what they were supposed to do, right? We don't just come out and secure balances, we don't secure transactions. We verify the services that we provide. That's what proof of service is, right? These are services like permanent data storage, storage integrity, AI inference, data availability, things like that. So consensus from our perspective without service verification is only half a blockchain, right? And in the case of general purpose blockchains like Ethereum, like Solana, where you can run these high powered dApps, and again, you have this level of vertical integration and scaling, that's okay. But when you start to need to provide very robust services that are both computationally and storage heavy, those services need to be run in a true independent decentralized scheme. And so proof of service, more or less from a layman terms basis, is saying, hey, we take the existing validator set that we have today and a subset of these validators, potentially more, right, that aren't in the active set, but a subset of validators run a high-powered, super intense client that we call supernodes, right, a layer above validators. And these supernodes, while they also are running their validator client, they're running what we call Cascade for data storage, Inference for all of our AI tools, these custom service-oriented modules, what our customers are actually paying us for and using us for, right? And the proof of service is the intrinsic consensus that powers these supernodes across the entire ecosystem. So for one instance, just as an example, so you understand kind of what I'm getting at here, every block we have what's called, a proof of storage test, where a random quorum of supernodes inspects another random quorum of supernodes and says, hey, you're supposed to be storing this data from this file, from this user on this block. Are you storing that? Yes, you pass. No, you're slashed, right? And so those types of consensus enforcement metrics ensure, obviously, that the services we're providing are continuing to operate in a completely trustless and decentralized fashion.
So basically, you could say that Lumera supports AI workloads without centralizing computation via the proof of service.
Absolutely.
And what do you feel makes a super node operator very strong? I mean, what are you looking at when you are choosing the super nodes operators?
hmm You said what makes a supernode very.
A strong super node operator. What are you looking when you are selecting those operators?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, again, anybody can run a supernode on
Mhm.
their own, right? That's the permissionless feature of the network. The foundation, though, it does require a self stake where you self bond a certain amount of looms to your supernode, right? Um, as you might self bond a small amount of loom to run a validator. But in the case of a supernode, you have to self bond a higher amount, demonstrating obviously a higher investment. Obviously, one thing to keep in mind is that in the case of general proof of stake networks, when you delegate to a validator, which is the same in terms of validation and delegation in all Cosmos chains and Lumera,
Mhm.
uh, validator, right? When you bond your stake to a validator, the delegators earn obviously anywhere from 90-95% on average, depending on the commission of
Yeah.
the validator, and the validators earn obviously the residual. With respect to proof of service income that supernodes run directly, the supernode operators earn 100% minus a percent that we burn, right? And so they earn 100% of the actual revenue accrued by these different proof of service streams. So it's very important to your point that we have strong operators, and that's where the self stake requirement comes into play as well, given the potential outsized returns from obviously a lot of the income streams. So what we look for really is strong operators, right? You have to be running redundant infrastructure across obviously storage, GPUs, CPUs, etc. You also have to be optimizing for both uptime and latency, right? You need to consistently be online. You need to be able to power a number of different concurrent streams that are coming through, and you need to kind of treat it more like a business, not necessarily a passive hobby. You have to be actively engaged and involved in operating your client, making sure it's up to date in all times. Especially in startup growth mode, we're constantly rolling out new features. We're constantly rolling out new releases. We want supernodes who are constantly updating and activating new clients on the scheme, actively being part of even the testnet or devnet sets of supernodes where they're testing in real time and understanding obviously what aspects of what we're doing can be improved upon and made better, and how can they really be more involved. We actually have a new module coming out. It's called LEP4, and this is really important because LEP4 really improves reliability overall across the supernode base without necessarily discouraging a lot of the operator sets. Um, and this is a way to basically ensure that supernodes are consistently auditing each other in real time. Um, where we'd rather have few great operators than many fragile ones.
Yeah, I think we got at this point since I mean, validator businesses, most of them started like, as you said, as a hobby or as like a passive investment. I'm just gonna run a node. But these days, and especially these days, running a validator company, you need to actually act like a business. Because if you are running multiple networks, you need to make upgrades constantly. Every network has some sort of other requirements that they differentiate with other networks. So it's a matter of business. We're not talking anymore about just running some nodes for a passive investment, which I think is good, because this is what networks need. We are crypto projects. They are not projects anymore. They are companies. They need revenue.
Absolutely.
How does the rewards model work for proof of service?
Which component?
How does the rewards model work for proof of service?
Oh, gotcha. So there's really a dual reward mechanic that spans both staking and service. And so, really, the economic logic is as follows: staking secures the network, and this is done very similar to all other
Mm-hmm.
Cosmos based networks. Your validator client, right, operates independently and does what validators do, ensure consensus, validate blocks, create blocks, etc. And more or less, those validators can both self bond and have obviously delegation from third parties. They charge obviously a commission on block rewards, but the majority of block rewards are obviously accrued to a pool and distributed back to delegators. And staking, in terms of that bonding, is really what secures the network in that regard. Service rewards really create the economic demand, right? And so proof of service is more like this. You run your validator, you do everything we just talked about. Then you enable your
Yes.
supernode client. And that supernode client is what powers those modules: storage, compute, AI models, whatever it might be. And supernodes obviously charge a fee to users in order to provide said services back. Hey, you want to store this piece of data? It's going to cost X amount of Loom for a one-time fee for permanent storage. Hey, you want to acquire X amount of inference credits to run these models or do these things? It's going to cost this amount of Loom. And so those are the proof of service fees that are charged to users. Those service fees are obviously accrued back and shared across the supernode operators themselves directly. When both exist, both these staking rewards and these service rewards, tokens are far less just pure speculative instruments, right? They're effectively a important critical component of overall economic demand and the tokenomic scheme of the ecosystem we've built. And really, security without usage is kind of dead capital in a way, right? There
Exactly.
needs to be obviously important service components, which is what obviously the proof of service system has enabled.
You mentioned this a little bit earlier, but how do dynamic inflation and fee burns contribute to the sustainability of the network?
Mhm. Right. So more or less as follows. Um, we run obviously a consensus metric and model that looks at both the trailing inflation relative to the target inflation of the network. Obviously, the input variables that are tied to this have directly what to do with the amount of tokens that are being bonded on the network itself. And we have a target of 66% of all supply is being staked or bonded. Right now, I
That's
think
like
we're
the
at about
standard
half.
for the Cosmos network, right?
Absolutely,
It's like
absolutely,
the most. That's when the network is like the most optimized.
exactly, exactly. And so, really, more or less, the concept here is that inflation really bootstraps supply early on when usage is low, and then fee burns really compress that supply as usage scales and becomes more deflationary. Fee burns come in the model of both proof of service. I mentioned everything goes back to the supernode operators. We do burn obviously part of that fee first. So as the network gets up and running, supply is obviously, inflation's a bit higher. It encourages people to start to stake tokens. They start to bootstrap and better secure the network. Obviously, as services up and running, there's potentially a higher amount of initial uh, service reward APR that can be accrued to supernode operators. Supernode operators get up and running, and it creates somewhat of a flywheel, right? Where we start to onboard new partners. Partners obviously are providing data to the network. They're ramping up obviously their usage. That data obviously enables us to better support new features, leverage that data to train better models, et cetera, et cetera. And so as we have more partners that have started to use that platform, obviously higher service fees and revenues accrue to the network. That creates obviously incremental burn, token that's taken out of supply continuously, and it results in a deflationary effect as well. So the system really adapts to demand instead of kind of guessing it up front. And as we all know, static tokenomics really fail in dynamic systems like the one that we're building.
In terms of the token utility, can you explain us in a really simple way so everybody can understand?
Mhm. Right. So the token utility is effectively the usability where the token is the oil across the entire ecosystem, right? You use the token obviously to delegate or stake to secure the network, bonding it to
Yeah.
validators, obviously a critical part of it. But perhaps most importantly, um, utility is directly correlated to service offerings, right? If operators, if developers, and if users all need the token in order to actually execute the services that we provide, to store data, to run models, to purchase credits for inference, things like that, right? You have a direct correlation between the underlying use of the token and utility demand, right? And that utility is really what earns permanence overall. So utility is extremely critical. Everything that you do on Lumera requires Loom. You need Loom to do all those services and features. And that's what we're obviously selling to our customers and partners and clients.
Looking ahead, what does success look like for Lumera by the end of 2026?
Mhm. Success by the end of 2026, really comes from obviously a number of different facets. I would say first and foremost, we want multiple production workloads running daily across a growing number of different partners and a growing number of different ecosystems. So what do I mean by that, directly, right? We want to be integrated with a number of different L1 ecosystems, obviously across the Cosmos, but
Mhm.
also across Solana, Ethereum, etc. And then a number of, obviously that's really where the horizontal scale comes. And then a lot of the vertical integration, right? Where we scale up across different dApps and applications that live on Solana, that live on Ethereum, whether it's DeFi, whether it's NFTs, whether it's real world assets, right? Whatever it might be, because there's use cases and demand for our services across the entire ecosystem in that respect. So that's really where we view success overall, and I think we've laid out, pretty clearly as well in our 2026 roadmap what our internal baseline KPIs and metrics are. How many partners we want to onboard by this date, how much data we want to be stored on Cascade, how many inference requests we want operating on the network, what our target bonding capacity is, etc. And then generally speaking, that really results in supernodes earning more on average from service execution than inflation, right? And that's critical. That's where the sustainability of the tokenomics comes from. And then lastly, really developers treating Lumera as default infra, as you might with IPFS, as you might with Arweave, right? Not an experiment, not necessarily a proof of concept, but default infrastructure, right? Where we're supported across a number of both ecosystem players and off-chain providers as default infra. And so really, success is being that core critical infrastructure that people rely on more or less. And all those other things really go hand in hand.
A little bit over a year ago, Cosmos took like a big change with Magmar and Berry taking over with the Interchain Labs. And I wanted to know, how do you feel about this period? How do you feel about the Cosmos ecosystem in general?
Yeah. Listen, I think generally speaking, in terms of where Cosmos is today, I'm very excited. I think that they've done an incredible job over the last, really 3, 6, and even 9 months, both hitting on, obviously all, timelines and deadlines, get pushed and whatnot. But I think generally speaking, they've been consistently pushing out new updates, new releases, new features across the entire ecosystem. We at Lumera are constantly playing catch up to make sure we're supporting the most recent Cosmos SDK. So I've been super excited about the level of advancement and innovation. What also gets me excited too is, really with the kind of new culture in place, it's less of an island with respect to, hey, we're building out an amazing, layer zero, and people will come and they'll build on us, right? And it's more so, hey, we have a number of obviously L1s that are built on us. How can we better bridge our service offerings, whether it's data interoperability, asset interoperability, token usage, or whatever it might be, across other networks? And so what's excited me is both the internal kind of overall upsell, if you call it, features and support, but potentially even more important, if not more important, right, is really the interoperability support across Ethereum, EVM compatibility, and the like. And so I'm very much so excited about where the overall Interchain Labs is today, and where it's going.
They are still planning to go like multi-chain and have interoperability with EVM and Solar and everybody.
Yep, exactly.
On a more personal level, because you've been in this space for a very long time, what advice would you give to builders today?
hmm So I think a lot of times, builders potentially fall into the trap of um, maybe chasing narrative or kind of building narrative in arrears, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and they do that overlooking really what has staying power and kind of, compounding fundamentals in that regard. Um, really a lot of that, this market is extremely momentum driven, right? And momentum a lot of times may or may not, hide bad design until it kind of doesn't. And so I think builders who are entering the space today, and it's unfortunate, some of the best NFT marketplaces over the last this last week have shut doors, right? But it was just a couple years ago that a lot of these were looked at as top players in the space with tremendous staying power and usability, and a lot of it was momentum. And I think that a lot of times builders get stuck going down a build fast, break things, quick
Do you think
rabbit
like
hole.
they don't have like a business model mindset? Like, yo, we actually need customers, we actually need revenue, this shit is gonna go.
I actually think that it's a little bit of that view that potentially has obfuscated, or potentially become the driver of developers. Whereas from my standpoint, it should really be taking a step back and saying, hey, we will obviously develop a product that's going out to market. Listen, right, everything needs to have product market fit. There needs to be customers, there
Exactly.
needs to be ability, but we still are in kind of the early innings of Web3 in a lot of different ways, right? And so I guess my point being is that developers shouldn't necessarily be chasing the narratives, right? They should obviously be thinking about how they can compound the effects of critical infrastructure that they're building, right? Not necessarily focused on short term momentum, but overall long term fundamentals and where they find overall staying power in the ecosystem itself. What makes this a have to have, right? Is this an NFT marketplace that's nice to have today? Sure. But what makes this a have to have, right? Where in, 3, 5, 10 years, these companies aren't going to be living without us, right? And that's where I think a lot of the thinking and decision making needs to be more discerned.
How do you feel about the market today and
hmm
looking ahead in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's a lot of different variables at play here, right? You obviously got a lot of sensitivity still to monetary policy. Bitcoin has become far more correlated back to, really general, uh, tech risk on assets. Just as we were kind of starting to see that break, you've seen that correlation trade kind of picking back up. I think the most important things, obviously, there's a lot of bipartisan support overall in both Congress, White House, government, etc. And that's set the stage for continued regulatory certainty, which has supported a lot more investment in innovation and development in the ecosystem. And so I think we'll continue to actually see that unfold over the next 6, 12, and 18 months. And that encourages obviously a lot of actors to move in and continue to innovate. I think there's a lot of other factors at play here. Bitcoin ETFs, digital asset treasuries, a lot of kind of more market-driven, really volume and float-driven plays, and they have their place, right? We're obviously, I'm definitely a believer in digital asset treasuries over the long term if they're done properly, as I am with ETFs. But I think that some of these institutional tools that have come to market in the last year or so will certainly have, just as they had positive impacts in terms of short-term momentum and price activity, we'll see the same the other way. But what's exciting is last year was the largest deleveraging event in all of crypto. A lot of leverage out of the system, right? If you said that to me, 3 years ago, that hey, if 2025 is going to be the largest deleveraging event in all of crypto of all time, I would have said I probably suspect that Bitcoin will have a 50% plus drawdown and alt will have an 80% plus drawdown. Not what we saw. So I think it's actually a very healthy rebasement, especially seeing a lot of the staying power in the network. You also saw ETFs, flip from net inflow to net outflow, and we haven't necessarily, seen the dramatic, drawdown there. I actually think that, there's been while a lot of that institutional tooling has caused some volatility in the respects I just mentioned, it's also led to consistent kind of accumulation, right? If you look at the tape, there's not necessarily a lot of two-sided depth the way you would suspect. There's certainly more, bidirectional, deep support on the demand side. So I think we'll consistently see long-term accumulation from here.
Anthony, thank you very much for your time. One last question before you wrap this up. I want to know if someone wants to get involved in Lumera today, what do they need to do?
Absolutely. Yeah, if you're a general curious user, whether you're a retail trader, whether you're just a ecosystem enthusiast in terms of things that we're doing, I'd recommend that you join our Discord. We certainly run a lot of community-oriented activities. We call them kind of the Foundry campaigns. They could start to get up and running there. If you join our Discord and go to our Foundry page, lumera.foundry.io, something like that, right? It's on the website. They'll be able to start understanding and walking through various steps of the ecosystem, whether it's going through tutorials, whether it's watching videos, whether it's looking at certain suites. So that's where I would start. From a developer perspective, not much different. Definitely join our Discord, but join one of the dev-focused chats, whether it's the validators chat or the supernodes chat, and certainly follow our GitHub just to obviously see the things we're building. And start to obviously explore more. We have a lot of different programs out there for any type of user builder who wants to get involved, whether it's our Supernode Foundation program, whether it's our Validator Foundation program, whether it's our community ecosystem driven events. And so depending on what lens you come from, there's certainly something for you.
Anthony, that sounds great, and thanks a lot for your time. And I wish you all the best with Lumera in 2026.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Have a great one.
You too.